Hello and welcome to today's edition of Until Saturday, the Athletics College Football Podcast. I am your host today, David Ubben, here with Ari Wasserman, who I'm sure you're very familiar with, and our guy, Alabama writer, Kenny Smith, better known as Kennington Smith. He does some SEC stuff for us, covers Alabama. Fellas, how are we feeling today?
Feeling great. The new guy on the block and on this podcast, but I'm excited to be here, living the dream here in Alabama. And before Ari gives his piece, I wanted to say I listened to y'all's top 5 most intriguing quarterbacks, and Ari threw his name in at the end, but I am shocked that Cade McNamara was not in the top 5, seeing that he is the only player, not even quarterback, the only player in the country whose performance will determine someone's job fate at the end of the season. So wish he would have made the top 5, but I enjoyed that podcast.
We gave him a little bit of a microscope treatment in the QB Tiers podcast. We got into the Cade McNamara conversation. Ari, what's going on today?
My wife has a hard time sleeping. And if she wakes up in the middle of the night, she doesn't go back to sleep. And that has caused, some tension for me because I'm so afraid to wake her up in the middle of the night. The good news is we found something that could really help her. I'm not talking about NyQuil. I'm not talking about medicinal marijuana. I'm not talking about any of the things that melatonin, anything that people take. We are just going to play Cade McNamara games while he's on Iowa, just so she can sleep through the night. Because damn well it's going to be putting her to bed.
Not everybody can retire Spencer Petras, sorry.
Listen, guys, the idea of what is at stake at Iowa is super compelling and downright hilarious. The marriage of Cade McNamara and that offense couldn't be more boring to me. Like, it's the only reason why it's entertaining is because somebody is either going to kill or be killed at the end of the year. But if it was just a regular season without that insane contract, and you actually had to sit through an entire year of watching Cade McNamara throw 3-yard outs to a tight end on 3rd and 9, like, it would just, like, my wife will be so well rested by the time January comes along. We're going to have a hell of a winter and spring. There's nothing compelling to me about that other than what's happening with Brian Ferentz.
So is this basically like you're basically saying that Iowa football is like putting Ben Stein in a Rambo movie? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And you might be like, oh, well, there's a bunch of action around it, and certainly there is, but still Ben Stein.
Perhaps. Well, folks, we are in week 0, but August 28th, you're going to see some familiar names and familiar faces in the pod feed. Stars Matter, which is our recruiting podcast. I'm sure our listeners well aware. Ari, I think you have that tattoo on your chest, but that is your recruiting show, along with Manny Navarro, Mitch Light, and Grace Rayner. You guys are all on there pretty frequently.
We're all on there. It started off where it was just me and Mitch, but we're spreading the love
now. Got the party going.
It took a minute there, but we figured out at the Athletic and in college football that recruiting is important. So, they should just rename the feed Stars Matter, but that's not my.
We're working on it. You can also hear Max Olson and Sam Kahn's show and Power Hour with Nicole Auerbach and Chris Vanini. Be sure to follow this podcast feed Until Saturday on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm personally a Spotify man, but they're everywhere. Drop us a 5-star review. And if you leave a question with your review, we're probably going to answer it on the show in a mailbag. It's going to be pretty interactive this season, so we're looking forward to that. Subscribe to us on YouTube. We got new video content daily. And be sure to join us live this Saturday and Thursday on YouTube as we preview week 0. On Thursday, we'll recap Saturday's action. Ari and I will be doing that. And come, of course, be a part of our new Sunday Sound-Off stream. Not only alliterative, but very entertaining. That'll begin at about 6 o'clock Eastern. We're going to answer your voicemails, Twitter questions, YouTube comments. If you want to send us a woof, all that stuff coming off of Saturday's games, we can get to it. But today, fellas, we've got some business to get to. We're talking best case and worst case scenarios for the folks at the top of the heap in the SEC, which I'm told is college football's best conference. the Pac-12, which will be college football's most fun conference this year, and the G5, which we're told not to use. And if you ask Mike Oresco, is tantamount to a slur. But we're just going to go with Group of 5 today for simplicity's sake. Guys, let's start in the SEC. And let's start with the two-time defending champions, the Georgia Bulldogs. Now, it's easy to say that, well, we can't see a way that this team doesn't make the playoff, right? They're too talented. They're going to coast into the playoff, and that's their worst case scenario, is losing in the semis to Michigan or TCU, of course. So I'm sure we'll be back in the national championship race this year, or Ohio State or whoever we want to say, right? Am I off base here, Ari? Is there a lower floor for Georgia than in the playoff?
The floor for Georgia is losing in the playoff. The ceiling is winning in the playoff. It's like a 2-game season for them. I don't know.
That's a low house. That's like a 4-foot. That's like a 4-foot range. You better be crawling around that house.
What would have to happen in Georgia for them to lose 2 games in the schedule? Like let's come up with some sci-fi.
It's easy, Ari. Carson Beck stinks and Mike Poble
easy.
stinks. It's very possible. I'm just saying. Get them to 2 losses.
What 2 teams would beat them on this schedule if their quarterback was just fine?
If their quarterback was, well, I'm saying if he's
worse
not
going to
fine.
But like if he's worse than fine, then they have other people that will come in.
Well,
they're not going to have an awful quarterback.
Kentucky can do it. Ole Miss can do it. Tennessee can do it.
In what world can Kentucky do it? I'd love to hear
in the world where Devin Leary is a baller and they can't score, and Kentucky puts up 27 points.
Have you ever watched Georgia play football before? I'm just wondering. I'm just wondering.
If your quarterback's turning the ball over and stinks, you get.
What do you think this is? Like a cut scene from The Waterboy? Like, he's not going to turn the ball over 7 times. Like, Georgia literally sucks the life out of you. Like, Kentucky is not beating Georgia. What are you doing?
Listen,
it's not happening.
What is the floor? What is the floor? Kenny, am I crazy? Is there a floor where Georgia does not make the playoff? What's the point? Mr. Ari, regular season here. We want to make all the games matter. Well, then what's the point of even playing the next 12 games? They don't play any good
games. It's not my fault their schedule stinks.
I could see a floor where Georgia doesn't make the playoffs. I mean, if they lose 1 game in the regular season, which is possible, and I understand Ari's point that Georgia is dominant, but they did almost lose to Missouri last year. That was a game where they were down and had a ferocious run in the 4th quarter. But to act like Georgia is invincible against perceivably subpar opponents, I mean, we've seen that to be the case that they can't get beat. So if they lose 1 game in the regular season and then go into the SEC championship with 1 loss and lose that game against either an Alabama, LSU, Texas A&M, whoever that is, with 2 losses, we've seen that be the kiss of death in the playoff committee's eyes. And Georgia's schedule is not going to do them any favors. They're not going to have really any marquee wins to stand on, which is something that hurt Alabama last year. So 1 loss in the regular season, a loss in the SEC championship, and Georgia's not in the playoffs. So I could see it. Is it likely? Not really, but I can see it for sure.
Did Kenny say 1 loss in the regular season and then losing the SEC championship game?
Yes.
Okay, because I was going to push back at the notion that they could lose a game and then wouldn't get in. I think a 1-loss SEC champion is in 100% of the time.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So you would have to lose a game in the regular season, which they'll get a mulligan for. Because if they lose in the regular season, they're still probably going to be in Atlanta. And then once you're in Atlanta, playing in an indoor dome with those animals that are on that team, I don't know, they could play a really good team on the other end of it. They could play Bama or whatever, like they always do, and lose that game. I guess, theoretically speaking, you could just be like, well, they almost lost to Mizzou last year, so they're definitely capable of losing again. They didn't lose to Mizzou. And when's the last time Georgia was actually upset? Was it when they lost to South Carolina in 2019? Is that the last time it happened?
Yeah.
What game on this? And I'm not going to join you on the Kentucky can beat Georgia bandwagon. If that happens, that would be remarkable, and we'll talk about it when it does. But that's not something you predict. So
not necessarily predict, but theoretically possible. Yes, and I do think, Ari, you're underrating a lot of these dynamics. 2 things. One, when you're replacing as many pieces as Georgia does, there's always that level of doubt. You have a new OC. When you got the players that Georgia has, things tend to look really good, and you got good players. But I think the thing that, and our colleague Seth Emerson has talked about this a little bit this offseason, it's possible that some teams are going to be able to run on Georgia this year. They don't have the big space eater. You don't have Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis in the middle of the paint.
And it's very easy to lose track about how special those guys were.
Yes,
they were actually really, really, really special players. Yeah, I can buy that. Yeah.
And so if teams, if you don't have all of a sudden, hey, we're going to throw 4 guys at you and we can get to the pass with those 4 guys and you can't run on us with those 4 guys, plus the linebackers, don't overrate, losing the type of linebacker play that they did. And not to say that Georgia doesn't bring a ton back, but it's possible. So
yeah, it's highly unlikely
to me. But
it's highly unlikely to me that Carson Beck just stinks. He might not be special, but he's going to be a serviceable player, and they have a lot of talent around him. And it's just like, I'm looking at the schedule. It's like, are they going to lose to South Carolina? No. At Auburn, I guess could be tricky if you freestyle some stuff up, but probably not.
Yeah, maybe.
At home against Kentucky, that's not even a road game. Like, throw that one out. You have Florida and you have Ole Miss and you have at Tennessee on the road. And like, I know that there's a lot that has changed in, Athens since last year's Tennessee game, but that was like, I had to turn it off because like I got sick to my stomach. I felt bad for Tennessee. Like I was like, are they going to stop? Somebody.
It was tough. It was tough watch.
And like, you think if they're going to like stop that gap in 1 year with Joe Milton, like it's just a hard sell for me. So my idea, the one thing that concerns me with Georgia, and I don't know if this is cliche or not, but stop me if it is there is a certain temperament in sports where once you've reached the mountaintop and then you've gone back again, that there's a desire or a complacency that just human nature that sneaks in, and like the want to and the desire to win again has to be innate. And what Nick Saban has done at Alabama is continually, or at least 90% of the time, get the best out of his players regardless of what has already been accomplished. And like, this is a very interesting year for Kirby Smart, and the idea that Georgia is going to have to prove, like, are they a team that is turning into Alabama, or do they have a really cool 2-year run? Like, is this the manifestation of becoming the next Nick Saban and the next Alabama, or not? So to me, if this team lost with the team that they have coming back 2 games and didn't make the playoff this year, that would be a huge disappointment, and also a very big red flag for me in the idea of Georgia doing the Sabanation of the SEC, which is taking it over. So it's a very critical year for me in Georgia and the way that we perceive them as well, in my opinion.
For the record, I think Georgia's in the playoff. I think they coast in the playoff, but I'm going to entertain the possibility that they don't.
I'm taking a notepad of the things that you say, though. Like I've got Texas. Like I've got a Dave Ubben notepad here, because you're not going to like the thing about podcasting sometimes that I really like, but sometimes I hate is that, when you say shit, you can just like throw it out there and then like 2 months go by and then everybody forgot that you said it. I'm keeping receipts, pal. I'm not going to forget. Like you might forget what I say. And people always remember when you're wrong. They never remember when you're right. But
I make sure they remember when I'm right. Yeah.
I want to make sure that we remember when you were wrong too. Texas is going to knock Georgia out of the playoff.
Okay. All right. Let's have the Bama conversation.
Okay, let's do it.
Kenny, we've talked about Bama on this podcast a lot. I think Ari is a little higher on them than I am. I generally have been driving the Bama's going 9-3 bandwagon most of this offseason. I don't love the offense. Is that the floor for Alabama? I think clearly this is a team that would not surprise anyone by winning the national championship this year. Everything goes right. So we don't have to talk about the best case scenario with them. But is there a floor below 9-3 where Bama ends up in the basement?
I don't know if I could see more than 3 losses. I mean, 3 losses in the Nick Saban era, I don't have it up in front of me, but how many times has that happened outside of his first season? Has it happened since then? That would be.
I believe Mr. Steven Garcia delivered one, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay,
like,
well that would be a pretty historic drop off if they were to lose 3 by itself. You look at their schedule. I mean, there are a lot of losable games: Texas A&M, Ole Miss, Tennessee, LSU. The Iron Bowl is always going to be a competitive game. We'll see what happens there with Hugh Freeze. So there's a collection of games where you could say, okay, I could see Bama losing that one, but I would say 3 is definitely the floor. And the question that I would have is, if Bama were to go 9-3, what would that season look like from start to finish? How many quarterbacks would they start in a 9-3 season? What would their receiving core look like? That's probably one of the more underrated storylines outside of quarterback, is the fact that for a long time, Bama's always had that dominant number one receiver. That's almost in Alabama's DNA as much as running the ball well and playing good defense. When you think about Julio Jones and all the way up until this last run with J-Mo and John Mechie, they didn't have that last year. It's unclear if they're going to have that this year. So what became of the receiver room? Did the defense correct their discipline errors? Penalties were a huge problem last year. So with two new coordinators, did those things get corrected, or was it, just a continuation of last year without the star power that they had in 2022? So I see 9-3 as the floor. We see a comment. They went 10-3 in 2010. Okay.
Yeah,
so
I was correct. That was the Steven Garcia year. That's the only time other than year one that Saban has lost 3 games in one regular season.
Is there?
So it's hard for me to see them going below that. But
Is
that would be,
say
that's
below
a
that?
good floor. Yeah, below. He said, "Is there a floor?" He said, "Is there a floor worse than 9-3?" I don't see that.
I think
Dave
that's
said.
Right.
Dave goes, "Ari's a lot higher on Alabama than I am," and I guess that's true because you can't get lower than you are on them.
I just think in the new SEC, you got to be able to score. Kenny, do you see, like, when you look like when Jermaine Burton left Georgia and Georgia sort of just shrugged, even though they didn't really have any great receivers, and they were like, okay. And then he had a pretty modest year last year. And then, I like Kobe Prentice made a couple plays. Corey Brooks, I think, is like the most, like, the best bet to be the number one guy. I just don't. Am I wrong? Is there a world in which any of those guys become like, a 1,400-yard receiver?
I don't see it. A 1,400-yard guy, I don't see it on this
1,200 yards, maybe.
Yeah. Maybe. I don't know if it's Burton or Brooks. I think, a bet will probably be Isaiah Bond, who, was a freshman last year and really flashed and is continuing to take that step forward. They have a group of like second-year receivers who people feel confident in. I think Bond is probably the furthest along in that. Malik Benson is a junior college transfer. And I feel like he's a player that within the fan base and the program that people are waiting on to pop, and it hasn't quite happened yet in fall camp, but that doesn't mean it won't happen during the season. So I don't see a dominant number one receiver at this point, but I don't even think that's going to be Bama's play style. I think they're going to really build an offense around running the ball, and that balance has kind of gone away from the program in the last few years when they've had this great run of quarterback play. And especially last year, it really felt like Bryce Young hero ball was the strategy that Bill O'Brien went with. So you bring in Tommy Reese. He really likes the RPOs and read options. I feel like Jalen Milroe is going to get the first crack at quarterback. So building the game plan around his skill set, and they have a really, really talented running back room. I don't really see them putting their receivers in a position where they're going to be the focal point of the offense. So I see an offense that's going to run the ball and try to hit deep shots when they can. And my money would probably be on Brooks as well. Most experience in the room, biggest, fastest, big play threat guy. Got to work on his consistency. I know drops have been a problem in camp for the receiver room. So I don't see that dominant guy right now.
I think that it's interesting with Alabama that this is the first team in modern recruiting rankings history to be a 90% blue chip ratio. And this is also the worst team in terms of, not the worst team, they haven't played yet, but the team that has the most question marks in a decade. Like, the two things don't really equate well. And it's like when I'm listening to Kenny talk about them, of like run the damn ball, like that Southern like idea of just Chase McClellan rushing it up the middle and unstoppable way, like, makes me like queasy, because that's like, you have to throw the ball all over the place to win the national championship. You can't just, you're not gonna be able to do that. Listen, too, we were just talking about Georgia's schedule. Alabama's playing Texas, Ole Miss. They have back-to-back games at Mississippi State, which is a, sneaky talented team. Then you're on the road at A&M. Then you have Arkansas. Then Tennessee, LSU, at Kentucky, and at Auburn. That's a really, really hard schedule. So, like, for me, it's like if Georgia played that schedule, I'd be like, okay, maybe their ceiling, their basement's 2 losses, but like Alabama's schedule is twice as hard as Georgia's, and they might have to play Georgia in the SEC championship game. So the one thing that's for sure is I don't know what they're going to be. I would not pick them to win a national championship because of circumstance as well as the question marks on the roster. You can't control your schedule and you can't control how good LSU is this year, but you certainly can control the fact that it's like, what happened to Ja'Cory Brooks? He's not a 5-star guy. Like, why is he not great? Or why is he not somebody that you can count on? You know, I'm looking at the recruiting classes and I see, you know, they've gotten quite a bit of talent here. And I know Bond was a top 50 player nationally. And, you know, they have some other guys here on the roster that should be very good. Like the idea that we can't identify a single player who could be 1,000-yard receiver for them is very alarming, especially considering the fact that there's some people that are worried that Jalen Miller can't even throw it that well. So like when you add all that up together, like I can see where Dave is coming from. That said, I don't think a team with a 90% blue chip ratio is going to drop 4 games on this planet or any other planet.
Well, let's get to the team that is this whole conversation is built for, Ari. The most
Kentucky?
fun conversation. No, not Kentucky.
You had me fooled, bud.
Ari, get your thumbs up. Go get your wife. It's time to talk about the Aggies.
My cult Aggie wife.
Yes,
babe, we're talking about the Aggies. Wait, what is it? Gig 'em.
Yeah, the gig 'em. Ari, I think that there is a world in which Texas A&M has another losing season. I think there is a world in which Texas A&M wins. I think there's a world in which Texas A&M wins the national championship. Am I insane?
No, you're not insane. When you talk about basement and ceiling with a program, it's like you're at the top of the stratosphere or you are like underground 9 floors. Like, I don't know. Listen, do you think if everything went well and Connor Wegman was awesome and Anais Smith goes crazy and they get their run game back, their offensive play calling is functional and their defensive line is just nasty beyond belief, that they could win a national championship this year? Like, I think on paper they have a team to do it. They're much more like Alabama and Georgia than they are like Vanderbilt. Or
5th most talented team or 4th?
Yeah, I think they're 4th in the country. So like they are built from that standpoint to compete with those teams. The question is, maybe you start with a 10-win season first, and then you start talking national title.
In theory, in theory,
you know. And I guess I skipped that step with the horns a lot, but you know me, man. Like, I've written over and over and over again that if A&M continues to keep these guys on the roster and sign classes like this, that they should be very good. Now, they have a kitchen. They're cooking up some stuff in that kitchen. I don't know if it would pass the health code. Somebody comes into the kitchen, they might get a grease stain somewhere with all the chemistry issues that they could have. But at the same time, too, it doesn't mean you don't make some sick ass nachos back there. You know, doesn't have to be clean for it to be good. And I wonder if it's going to be really, really good, because they do have the ingredients to make something really special. It's just A&M is a walking disaster at every turn, and they were much worse off last year than they probably should have been. And you have a coach who's, you know, handing over the play calling range to another coach who, you know, is very interesting in his own right. So to me, it's like a recipe of can't miss television.
So Texas A&M is basically Waffle House. We're either going to have the best meal of your life or food poisoning. It's basically
Texas A&M is Iowa, but like entertaining.
And
talented.
That's an interesting point, because I went back and watched today. Actually, I watched Texas A&M and Bama's game from last year, and I saw their offensive rankings, and I thought to myself, Texas A&M and Iowa are like the Spider-Man meme where they're like pointing at each other, except
they were, like you said,
you know, Texas A&M is a lot more interesting, and they got the 5 stars and you know, Jimbo and that storyline. But you know, I'm somewhere closer to where Ari is at, where I think that, you know, I feel like their ceiling is probably like a New Year's 6 level team. It's hard for me to envision them making a run to the national championship, but they do have the talent. And, you know, you're bringing up the point of them potentially winning the West. Their 2 games against Alabama in the last few years have gone down to the last play of the game. They beat them in 21 last year. It went down to basically a goal line stand. They beat LSU last year in the last week of the season. If, you know, they were to beat Alabama and then they beat LSU in the last week of the season for bowl eligibility, will we be thinking about them maybe in a different way heading into the season versus them going 5-7? So they've shown that they can compete against the top teams in the West, even in a down year like last year. So I feel like they're a lot closer to contention than not, but it's hard for me to envision them making the playoff and going to the national championship this year, you know, a year after going 5-7.
let's tackle the Vols. Ari, what do you make? I live here in Knoxville, but I'm curious as somebody who doesn't live there. What do you make of? Where do you see this team's floor and ceiling?
I think that their ceiling is last year's team. Like, I don't know if they are going to be better. And you're there. You are, you've covered that program for many years and you live there, so you can tell me if I'm off base. But they have a lot riding on a quarterback whose main tenet of or main bullet point on his resume has been erratic. And I think like being erratic is a really hard thing to overcome and certainly a hard thing to count on. So, they are recruiting a little bit better. They brought in some transfers that, could definitely help them out. But when I look at Tennessee's ceiling, I don't see playoff. And I don't necessarily see, a team that is going to be competing for a national championship, even though they come in as a quasi top 10 team. But I also think that they still should be a far off basement from being a joke like they were a few years ago. Like, I don't know. I feel like if even if Bazooka Joe was awesome, that they would have a similar year to last year, which was a great year. I just don't know what ingredients this program added to be viewed as a ceiling that could be any higher than that.
I think that's fair. I think New Year's 6 feels like the ceiling for them. Georgia just really exposed some of their limitations last year in terms of just having the quality of athletes that you've got to have to get in the playoff and to have success in the playoff. And I think people really underrate Hendon Hooker's pocket presence, extending plays, and making plays when things break down. Joe Milton, TBD, if he can do that, to say nothing of the well-earned accuracy issues. So I think the ceiling is probably New Year's 6, and the floor, it is hard for me to see them doing worse than 7-5. I mean, maybe, you have a year where you're in injury hell and maybe you go 6-6, but I think that eight mark is probably the realistic floor with a possibility of 7. Kenny, what do you see with the Vols?
Yeah, and I'm looking at their schedule now. 8-4 is my floor. You look at, I see Alabama, A&M, Georgia +1. That could be, at Florida week 3, could be South Carolina, maybe Kentucky. There's another loss out there in a floor type season. That's what I was going to say about Tennessee, even past Joe Milton's development and having to replace a lot of receivers. For me, it comes down to play along the lines of scrimmage. And when you mentioned that game against Georgia, what Jalen Carter was able to do in that game and wrecking their game plan and not allowing for Hendon Hooker to have time to hit his first read, and the physicality that Georgia was playing with on the defensive side that kind of disrupted Tennessee's game plan. That was, I think, an eye-opener for that program, and really a lot of people that saw Tennessee beat Alabama the way that they did, and then when you saw what happened when they played Georgia. So my question for Tennessee is, are they going to improve along the lines of scrimmage, and are they going to play with the necessary physicality to truly challenge Georgia and make that next step into playoff contention? So part of that is recruiting. They're going to have to start winning recruiting battles for the 5 stars along the offensive and the defensive line. Maybe somebody like a Darnell Wright going top 10 will help Josh Heupel in recruiting. I know David Hobbs is a highly touted defensive lineman. That was a battle that they won last year. They're going to have to continue to stack those classes and develop those guys if they're going to reach that next step. But I'm looking at this team and I like the pieces that they have. New Year's 6 does feel like a good ceiling, and 8-4 would be my floor.
What I'm thinking here, Dave, and I want you to walk me through this here. I'm looking through, and because Kenny made some good points here about recruiting, and I know that people get frustrated when I talk about it too much, but I'm looking at Tennessee's
lifeblood.
Yeah, I know, but people are like, "Oh, this guy's a one-trick." Okay, that's fine. But I just want to understand this, or at least put it out there, that Tennessee last year is perceived to be one of the leaders of NIL, right? One of the at least the program that has one of the most competent and fast acting collectives out there, as you've written about.
I can tell you they just are. They're more than perceived to be. I've done enough reporting in that space that they've
and so
money and competency.
Money and competency means you have your shit together and you can fix some problems with some cash, okay? And then I go and I look at their class last year, and I see Nico, who is there as a 5-star quarterback, a top 5 player nationally. But then they've signed, I believe, 4 players in the top 100 in totality. And it's like Alabama literally just signed 9 5-star prospects. And your entire class with the NIL and money competency behind you manages 4 top 100 players. The gap between those two things, you know what that looks like? It looks like what happened in the Georgia game last year. So like when everybody talks about like, can money fix problems and can money, put yourself in a position to compete at the highest level and to win a playoff game, I go, absolutely. But money has to equate to 10 to 12 to 14 top 100 players in a single class, not 4. So if the team that is most competent with the financials of this whole thing and the collective and in acquiring top level talent can only muster up 4 top 100 players in a single class, then I feel like that to me is proof enough alone that we're a little bit further away from NIL ruling the show than we think we are. Is that
maybe? It's a complicated conversation. So like that was a talking point around Tennessee last year is they get Nico and there's this idea, sort of like Arch at Texas. So Arch, commits to Texas and they get like 4 or 5, bunch of like bang, 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 quick ones. Tennessee did not have that when they got Nico. They added a couple guys, but the sort of wave of recruiting shockwaves when they got Nico didn't really happen. And maybe that's because you need more of a proof of concept. And maybe that's part of it. But, Steve Sarkisian doesn't, walk into recruiting rooms with, national championship rings from Texas. So, I don't know.
Texas
I don't have
also
a good answer for that.
has 30 players in the top 100 in their state too.
Yes,
like that's there's a little bit different too of like, oh, Jonte Cook, a 5-star receiver from DeSoto who lives 3 hours away, sees Arch Manning commit. Of course he's going to go there. Tennessee's whole thing is going to be accumulating talent on a national level. And I know there's some talent in Tennessee, but it's a long state. It's a weird state when it comes to like geographical allegiance. And you have every team in the South and even some teams in the Big Ten going down into Nashville and the places where the talent does exist. It's like they got to face Alabama and Ohio State in their own state every time someone's good there. So, like, to me, it's like if that is the result, I don't know what the reason is or like the shockwaves of what happened with Nico, but I don't see a team that is paying for mega classes here because they didn't have a mega class. And if you want to take the next step in the SEC and not only go 8 or 9-0 and then beat Georgia, but win a national championship, do you see how far of a gap there is between who they were last year for how great they were? One of the most entertaining teams in the country to watch last year. They got their asses kicked. It was like unbearable to watch. And it's like, you don't fix that with Nico. You don't fix that with 3 players. You fix that with recruiting classes with 10 top 100 players in it for 5 freaking years in a row. And we are so far away from that happening. I don't give a shit who they brought in the portal. Like that to me is like, if you want to spend your money, make it rain, baby, because you're far away from being what you need to do to be Georgia. Or
if you're gonna make it rain, do it more efficiently. Like if I don't know what their NIL budget or whatever it was, but they sent a lot of it to Nico when you would probably think that what Josh Heupel's been able to do with quarterbacks and what his development was with Hendon Hooker and what they were able to do with receivers might sell itself to skill players, but you send a lot of money to a quarterback. Maybe you don't have enough money to disperse out to offensive linemen, defensive linemen, pass rushers, linebackers, players in the secondary, whatever it is. That's probably what I would spend my money on if I was Tennessee's collective or their program, is let the proof of concept that we have built out with what Hendon Hooker did, with what Jalen Hyatt did, use that to bring in then skill players, and then use the millions of dollars or whatever it is to attract players from other positions and build out my class that way. Almost seems like hustling backwards. I understand that you have to have an elite quarterback to compete at the highest level, but that would probably be my approach if I was Tennessee.
Well, we did a thing here, and I know David, and we're kind of going a little bit long here, but
no, you're good.
I don't want to make this. It's not fair to Tennessee to just make this an NIL discussion. The reason why it turned into an NIL discussion is because we're talking about them in the framework of contention for the national championship.
Well, that's their best bet to catch up to Alabama and Georgia,
and their best bet to do that is through this. And even though they are ahead of the market, they are so far off. And I did a story, and I think maybe you and I did it together. We've done a lot of stuff. I can't remember if this is solo or not, but I called 10 or 20 recruiting staffers in America last year, and I just asked them, if you had X number of millions of dollars to go out and sign a class with it, how would you go about doing it? And nobody said I would give 80% of it to the quarterback and then see what happens from there. Like, if that's what happened, and I don't know the financials of what happened with Tennessee last year, but if that's what happened, it almost seems like a short-sighted thought that it's like, oh, we're going to go pay this dynamic player who lives in California and knows a lot of recruits a ton of money to come here and just expect everybody to come because he's coming and not get their payday too. I would spread it around and maybe go for a middle-tier quarterback that's dynamic and talented but doesn't command such a price tag, and try to spread the wealth so that the bodies in my rooms, every single room is stacked with blue chip talent. And to the point where you get to where Georgia is right now, where it's, even if Carson Beck is fine, I still think that Georgia is going to compete for and potentially win the national championship. You do that by spreading it around and signing class after class after class that's completely and utterly loaded with top 100 players in there. And that's the only way. There's no shortcut. And everybody who thinks that NIL is going to ruin the sport, like, pay attention, baby. It's not happening. It didn't happen in year one without regulation. Even if it doesn't get regulated, people are going to start spending less when they realize that, hey, what if Nico stinks? They're not going to want to pay that much money again to somebody else like that. It's only going to go down from here, I think. So it's just, NIL isn't the game changer that we think it is. And I think that as the years go on, we're going to start to see that more and more. And Tennessee might just be Exhibit A, and maybe even A&M might be Exhibit A of money spent. And hey, we said it on the podcast the other day, Dave, money can't buy anything in this sport.
Well, let's shift the discussion to LSU. I've been driving if Georgia doesn't win the national championship, LSU is the next best bet train this offseason along. I don't really understand the LSU-Bama debate. LSU seems clearly better to me. Brian Kelly has not won single-digit games since going 4-8 in 2016. Now he obviously is in a much more difficult situation, but a better roster. Are we in agreement that the ceiling is national championship for this team? And I'll start with you, Kenny. What's the floor?
The floor for me would probably be 10-2. Maybe 9-3. I mean, you look at their schedule. They're starting off with Florida State. That's going to be a top 10 matchup. In my opinion, they're winning that game, but that is a losable game.
You can lose it.
Then you have Alabama, obviously, Texas A&M they lost to last year. So those are 3 losable games right now. They have to go to Ole Miss as well. So this isn't a cakewalk schedule by any means. So I could see them dropping a few games, but I don't see them going any lower than 9-3 in the worst case scenario. Their ceiling is definitely national championship. You think about what they were able to do in year one with Brian Kelly, and that was without Mason Smith, who's one of the premier defenders in the sport. They lost him in week 1 and then still went on to do everything that they did. They bring him back. They brought in a top 10 recruiting class from the high school level. They brought in one of the best transfer portal classes year 2 in the system on the offensive and defensive side for those players. Their star power everywhere. Depth is probably their biggest question mark, but at the top level, frontline starters, this is one of the best teams in the country. So I could see them competing for a national championship, and I don't see them slipping past a New Year's 6 game at their floor.
Ari, do you have any questions about LSU?
I think my number one question would be if Jaden Daniels is good enough to take that next step. And I know that we're so quarterback oriented in the sport, and there's a lot of I think they had some key transfers come into the secondary, and there's some depth concerns, or if they suffer a bad injury here or there, that could expose a weakness in an entire room. But I think in order for LSU to be the team that you're so desperately saying they're going to be, they have to have elite level quarterback play. And I know that we saw some improvement and certainly flashes from Jaden Daniels down the stretch of last year when they won, 6 or 7 games in a row. 5 in a row, but at the same time too, they're also a beneficiary of not having to play Tennessee this year. And that's another team that, kind of embarrassed them on the field a year ago. So do you think that he's going to take that? I mean, I know that Jordan Travis hype is huge at Florida State and whatever, but like Jaden Daniels was a very high pick in our Heisman draft too. And it's like, I've watched him play quite a bit in his career, and I've seen the fun flashes when he was at ASU, and I've seen the downs last year. I just don't know if I look at him and go, that's one of the top 3 quarterbacks in America this year. And it's like, does he have to be that in order for them to score the 40 points that LSU is going to need to score when they play, Alabama, or when they play, teams that are equally talented as them? Because I do agree that their ceiling is national title. Like they've got the talent to do it. But I don't know if I feel really great about picking them to win the SEC right now because I don't know that I'm in love with their quarterback.
I agree with you. I don't know that he, has me fawning, but I don't think he has to be Superman. I think their team is good enough. Their defense, especially the front seven, is good enough that I think. Here's my question for you. If Jaden Daniels does exactly what he did last year, can LSU win a national title? Because I think the answer to that is yes.
I don't.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know. Like you're the one who always talks about like a quarterback needs to will you to win.
But he is an impact player. He's just not Superman.
He's an impact player, but he has plays that make you just want to put your head into the dirt. I don't know. I
don't think he had not very many of those the last month of the season. I totally disagree with you there. At first month and a half, I would probably agree with you.
Yeah, but so then I mean, I watched the did I ever tell you that last year I went to Las Vegas for my fantasy football draft, and I was there with a bunch of buddies, and we had a draft room at the Green Valley Ranch there, and it was a pretty big buy-in league, and we all collectively decided to bet on LSU against Florida State with the league money. And we all, as a team, and then it's like if we lose, then we lose the league money, and we all play for fun this year. And if we win,
now I know why you hate Jaden Daniels. Sorry,
but I just like that game. No, it's just like whatever. But they couldn't get a first down for 4 quarters, and I understand that was the opener on a Sunday, and he grew a lot out the season. But it's like that Jaden Daniels has to be dead and gone.
Yeah,
because if he still exists in any realm, then they won't win a national championship this year. So certainly agree with you that he is tremendously better than that game later on. But I've seen the bad of Jaden Daniels, and the bad of Jaden Daniels has to be gone.
Yeah. Let's shift to the Pac-12 real quick, Ari.
41 minutes in, let's shift.
I don't think USC can win a national title, Ari. I think they can get to the playoff. I don't see it. I don't believe that this defense will be better, even close to what it needs to be to get to that point. I'm going to say 9-3 is the floor for this team.
USC has a gnarly schedule. Have you looked at it?
Yes.
Okay.
It's a problem.
Like
there's a bunch of good teams in the Pac-12.
The Pac-12 this year has a ton of awesome quarterbacks, which makes it one of the most entertaining leagues. And I do think it's hilarious that it's disbanding when it's like the most fun it's ever going to be. Yes. This year. That kind of stinks. But their last 6 games are at Notre Dame, home against Utah, at Cal, which is kind of a breather in the middle. Then they close with Washington, Oregon, and UCLA all in a row. So in order for them to make the playoff, they probably can only lose one of those because there's no 2-loss team going to be making the playoff in the Pac-12.
No.
And I don't think their defense is good enough or will be good enough to not lose more than once during that stretch. I've always thought that they could make the playoff because the Pac-12 stinks, and that if you have any pulse in the Pac-12, they almost did it last year. Their defense was borderline. I don't know, borderline. It was pathetic. It was awful. It was disgusting. It was treacherous. It was disaster. It was a catastrophe. And they still literally were a half a football away with a healthy quarterback for making the playoff a year ago. I think they could have the same exact team and still flirt with the playoff again, but I don't. The problem for them is that the Pac-12 was just much better this year, and their schedule was hard. So I've got a grand riding on this with Andy Staples. Like if they don't make the playoff this year or next year, I owe them $1,000. I was confident as hell that they were going to make it last year before the season started. And I don't really feel great about it. Now they might sneak into the 12 teamer and I'm going to have to get paid, sucks to suck, Andy. But like, what did they do in the offseason that made you think that they were going to completely wholesale correct their entire defense?
Barry Alexander is not
Barry Alexander, right?
Playoff ticket. Yeah.
Sick condo, though. Sick condo.
Yeah. Kenny, when I look at the other, 2 of the other contenders for the Pac-12, I don't see a lot of difference in Oregon and Washington. Very fun teams, very good quarterbacks, new coaches. I guess I buy them as playoff. I think they have a lower ceiling, 7-8 wins probably. Kenny, what do you make when you look at Oregon and Washington?
Yeah, I would agree with you there. I think what sticks out to me about Oregon is what Dan Lanning is trying to do in terms of bringing in defensive talent to make them a little bit more of a complementary team. I mean, you look at their transfer portal class and what they brought in, covered Iowa last year, so I really like the Justin Jacobs addition. Kyrie Jackson was a starter at Alabama fringe last few years. Jordan Birch was a former 5-star that didn't quite materialize in the way that maybe people expected him to at South Carolina, but somebody who's probably still a good player and somebody who's going to play a big role on their team. So I do see a pathway for them to potentially, make the playoff. I think, again, it's going to take a historic season from them. Like Ari said, it's going to take one loss from a Pac-12 team to do that. So I don't quite see it. I don't think that they're dipping below 7-5, though. I think their floor is probably a little bit higher than that, maybe 8-4. Washington, I definitely love their team. And I think Michael Penix is a dark horse Heisman contender if everything goes accordingly this year. I feel the same way about them and their floor. I really don't see them dipping below 8 games either. So I don't have last year's Pac-12 standings in front of me, but I think it was last year where they were, teams with 11-1, 10-2, a few 9-3s, 8-4s, all the way down. I feel like it's going to be like that again in the Pac-12. So I see both of those teams as like floor 8-4, ceiling 11-1, 10-2, and it's just going to be a fascinating race.
I feel like the odds of Oregon or Washington, Oregon or Washington making the playoff is about like Georgia not making the playoff, and that like I really don't think it's going to happen, but like if you showed me a world where it did happen, I'd be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Ari, where are you at on these guys?
I think that they blend together a little bit. And I feel like, and maybe I'm nuts on this, but am I the only one that thinks that the only Pac-12 team that's going to make it is USC
this year? Or
in
general?
Yeah, I think it's going to be USC or anybody else.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I think that's probably about right.
I look at Washington and I think we're too high. I look at Oregon and I still think we're a year or two away. Mm-hmm. I think that they're going to be good, and I think they're going to be good enough to beat USC. I don't know if they're going to be good enough to get through their entire schedule and be a legitimate college football playoff contender. And maybe that's just a short-sighted view of it, but Oregon, I don't know. I watched the Georgia game last year, and I watched them, get out there a year ago and, struggle in a lot of the ways that they've done in the past, even without Mario Cristobal. And, the way that they lost that Oregon State game, I will never forget for the rest of my life.
Yeah, that was pretty bad.
To blow that 21-point lead without even the other team attempting to throw it. It's like the most demoralizing way I can remember in college football to lose a game. And I know that all that stuff happened last year, and there's some steps forward that have been taken place. But like with these two teams, like, are they actually going to be able to do it when people are expecting them to do it? Or are they going to come out of nowhere one time and actually do it? Like, I feel like USC has the same problem. I just, for as fun as the Pac-12 is going to be this year, I don't know if I take any of the teams outside of USC, and maybe not even USC, seriously in the national championship discussion.
Yeah. Aria, on a show last week, we talked about you cannot overlook Utah. But let me walk you through Utah's schedule this year. Florida at home, at Baylor, UCLA, at Oregon State, Cal, okay, at USC, Oregon, Arizona State, at Washington, at Arizona, and then they finish up with the Colorado Buffaloes. I think to me, when I look at Utah, I see if there's a absolute train wreck at the top of the standings that we're sitting there and wondering how Utah won a third Pac-12 in a row at 9-3 or whatever they finish at. I think the playoff is out of question with that schedule, even though I liked them for the playoff last year. Ari, when you look at Utah, what is your floor? And do you agree with me on that they could survive if the Pac-12 gets real cannibalistic at the top?
I mean, I feel like that's the only way that they're going to win the conference. Is if like Oregon beats USC and then USC beats Washington and Washington beats Oregon, and they all drop another game or whatever. Because like what if UCLA and Oregon State are sneaky good this year? I think I like the over of Oregon State 8.5 wins this year.
I'm with you,
especially if you look at their schedule. I think they're going to be sneaky good, and I'm super excited to watch DJU play. But like with Utah, when I look at their floor, I feel like they could still be a 7-5 or 8-4 and still be a pretty good football team at the end of the year. And that's kind of just the way it is all the time with them, even though they've won the conference back-to-back years. An 8-4 team that struggles a little bit, like it loses a game like at Florida or Baylor, and then, drops one to Oregon State, and then one more to Washington, but, beats USC, and Oregon is still really, really talented. I mean, you could be 8-4 in the schedule and still have a lot of good wins. And that's kind of the way that I view them. And I'm excited to see, the way Cam Rising comes back and recovers from that ACL situation that he had at the end of last year, but certainly think that Utah belongs in the conversation with the other three as potential Pac-12 champions for sure.
Mm-hmm. We got to close with the G5 here. We looked at, when I look at the teams that I think are most likely to get that New Year's Six bid, I point to UTSA, even without Zachary Franklin. Tulane, I've been beating the Willie Fritz drum for years. I don't know why more programs have not given him attention. I think I wrote, or maybe just said, Kansas should hire him like 6 years ago. Boise, Andy Avalos sort of rallied them, and Toledo. We've talked about them a little bit. Anyone else that jumps out at you guys as a team that can be New Year's Six bound that people are sleeping on? I'll start with you, Kenny. Who you got?
I don't know anybody. I can't really say anybody outside that you name. I really like Tulane because I feel like they followed the model of a team that is going to take that step in 2023. Like a Cincinnati, for example, like the year before Cincinnati made the playoffs, they go undefeated and they have that close game against Georgia, and that kind of set the table for them to make the playoff the next year. I think they had one Power 5 game on their schedule that year and then ran the table and made the playoffs. And then you look at what Tulane did. Right. You look at what Tulane did. They had that great season, then they beat USC, and now they come into this year. I believe Ole Miss is on their schedule. So if they were to beat Ole Miss and then run the table, maybe have one loss, then that's a team that I see as the one that's going to emerge as the New Year's Six level team. If they run the table and chaos ensues throughout the top 25, maybe they'll get a playoff shot. It is a long shot, but I think that's the team that I'm going to be putting my money on just based off of historical context and then how they've kind of followed that model entering this season.
Michael Pratt, gamer, and a guy that's got some upside for the NFL. Ari, what do you see
when you say contender? Do you mean like making the playoff or New Year's Six? Like, is that
can get in the New Year's Six? I mean, maybe playoff. I don't think anybody else can. I mean, the playoff conversation on the G5 is loaded and it's stupid. Like, don't get me started. But is there another team besides those four, UTSA, Tulane, Boise, and Toledo, that you think can crash the New Year's Six?
Well, the one thing that I would have said, because the four that you named are probably the four normal thought process places, but I'm very excited, and maybe this is just like the Dallas in me, because I'm such a Texan now. But SMU could be a sneaky good team this year. I'm very excited to see Preston Stone, kind of settle into that role at the quarterback position. He's a fringe top 100 player, and they have some big games against Oklahoma and TCU on the schedule this year, and to me, I feel like even though the AAC isn't necessarily what it used to be, losing four of their biggest brands, that they have a pretty interesting schedule and one of these places that just scores a lot of points. Now, it seems with SMU that every single year we get excited about them, and then it just kind of doesn't go that way. But if they could put up some points and have a star quarterback on their team, like, they could be a pretty interesting team to watch down the stretch of the season. So I think the four that you picked out are good. I think Frank Harris obviously deserves his own conversation as maybe one of the better quarterbacks in the country at UTSA, but SMU, watch out for them. I think they're going to be pretty good this year.
Yeah, I think so. Well, folks, enjoyed this show. This is a very entertaining conversation. I feel like it's broaching what is possible is always interesting, because I think that the season, when it actually arrives, has a way of defying that in some ways. And I think it's going to be, I really am excited for this season. So thank you guys for listening. Be sure you're following the podcast, wherever you listen to your podcasts, so that, when we have new episodes, they get delivered directly to your device. We always appreciate, of course, a 5-star rating and a review. Leave us a review and you'll probably see it in a mailbag episode or our Sunday sound off, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at Until Saturday. And we go live on YouTube every Saturday and Sunday night through the season. So I think Ari and I will be doing that a lot this year. So tune into that. So thank you guys for listening. Again, for Kenny Smith, for Ari Wasserman, this has been Until Saturday. I'm David Ubben. We'll see you guys again very, very soon.